My name is Nathan Cole, and I was 36 years old the afternoon I discovered my family had already spent an inheritance that legally didn't belong to them. I didn't find out through a phone call or a heartfelt confession. I found out because an invoice for $80,000 accidentally arrived at my office instead of my mother's address. I own a financial compliance firm, and for nearly 15 years, I've made a career out of following paper trails that people hoped no one would ever notice. My clients hire me because I don't trust assumptions. I trust signatures, bank transfers, and timestamps. That's probably why what happened next didn't break me the way my family expected. It simply gave me another file to organize. Before everything unraveled, my life had been ordinary in the best possible way. My wife, Julia, taught elementary school and somehow believed every child deserved another chance, even the ones who tested every limit. She had a habit of rescuing abandoned plants from grocery stores because she said they only looked dead because nobody had bothered to water them. We were married for 9 years before a distracted driver ignored a red light and erased our future in less than 3 seconds. After the funeral, people filled my refrigerator with casseroles and my voicemail with promises that I could call anytime. Within a month, the food had spoiled, the calls stopped, and silence settled into the house like dust. The only people who remained consistently present were my parents and my younger brother, Eric. At first, I mistook their sudden attention for concern. Later, I understood they weren't checking on me. They were checking on Julia's estate. My father had owned a chain of hardware stores before retiring, and he liked reminding everyone that everything our family possessed existed because of his sacrifices. My mother treated family loyalty like a debt that could never be fully repaid. Eric, 3 years younger than me, had inherited their talent for believing other people's success somehow belonged to him. He drifted from one business idea to another, leaving unpaid loans and disappointed investors behind while my parents insisted he only needed one lucky break. I had been financing those lucky breaks for years without realizing it. When Eric needed help covering rent after another failed startup, I wrote the check. When my parents wanted to renovate their lake house, I quietly paid the contractor after my father complained about rising costs. Every birthday, anniversary, emergency, an unexpected expense somehow found its way to my wallet. I never kept score because I honestly believed families weren't supposed to. Julia used to tell me generosity, without limits, eventually teaches people to stop saying thank you. I laughed whenever she said it. I don't laugh anymore. 4 months after losing her, my mother invited me to Sunday dinner. Halfway through dessert, she casually asked whether Julia's insurance policy had already been processed. The question landed harder than any sympathy she'd offered since the funeral. I answered that everything was being handled by the attorney. She smiled, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That's wonderful," she said. "Your brother finally has a chance to open his restaurant now." I remember blinking because I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. "What does Eric's restaurant have to do with Julia?" I asked. My father answered before she could. She would have wanted family to succeed. There it was. Not grief, not concern, just arithmetic. 2 days later, Eric showed up carrying architectural sketches for a downtown cafe he'd already named. He spread them across my dining table like we were business partners and pointed at expensive espresso machines, imported furniture, and custom lighting. Every few minutes he said things like, "Once your transfer comes through," or "after you release the funds," as though the decision had already been made. I finally interrupted him and asked who exactly promised him $80,000. He looked confused. "Mom and Dad said you did." I told him I'd made no such promise. His smile disappeared. "Come on," he said. "You don't need all that money sitting around." The sentence echoed through the room long after he'd left. I opened the notebook Julia had given me years earlier. She'd written on the first page, "When something feels wrong, write everything down before someone rewrites it for you." I began documenting every conversation, dates, times, exact wording. It became a habit almost immediately. 3 weeks later, the mistaken invoice arrived. It wasn't addressed to me, but my office occupied Suite 204 while my mother's book club rented Suite 204B for monthly meetings. Someone had omitted the letter. The invoice requested the final payment for banquet services, luxury catering, and event planning, totaling $80,000 for the grand opening celebration of Cole Kitchen, Eric's future restaurant. At the bottom, under billing contact, was my full legal name. Under authorized payer was a signature that looked enough like mine to fool someone who had never actually seen my handwriting. It didn't fool me. I stared at it for less than 5 seconds before recognizing the careful imitation. My mother had forged my signature. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront Eric. Instead, I placed the invoice into a new folder labeled simply Evidence, Years. And compliance had taught me one lesson above all others. Innocent people explain first and investigate later. Guilty people panic the moment they realize someone has started collecting documents. I intended to find out which category my family belonged to, and something told me I wouldn't have to wait very long. I spent the next week pretending nothing had changed. And that was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to confront my parents the moment I discovered the forged documents, but 15 years of investigating. Financial fraud had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe they're still in control. So I answered my mother's cheerful text messages with short replies, congratulated Eric when he sent me another rendering of the restaurant, and even accepted my father's invitation to Sunday dinner. They mistook my silence for surrender, and that mistake became my greatest advantage. Meanwhile, I quietly started pulling every thread connected to my name. Since the financing applications listed me as a guarantor, I had every legal right to request copies from the bank. The loan officer sounded surprised when I explained I had never signed any of the paperwork, but he agreed to meet with me privately the following morning. I walked into the bank, carrying nothing more than a leather folder, and walked out 2 hours later with nearly 200 pages of applications, vendor agreements, insurance forms, and personal guarantees. As I flipped through them in my office, one fact became impossible to ignore. My signature hadn't been forged once. It had been copied onto 12 separate documents over nearly 4 months. Someone had taken their time, practicing until the imitation looked convincing enough to fool lenders, contractors, and suppliers. Whoever had done it wasn't acting on impulse. They had planned this carefully. I called the handwriting examiner I had worked with years earlier during a corporate embezzlement case and asked if he could compare every signature. 3 days later, his report arrived. Every questioned signature originated from the same hand, and none of them belonged to me. Reading those words should have made me angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Anger clouds judgment. Certainty sharpens it. That afternoon, I called Margaret Lawson, an attorney whose reputation for handling financial fraud bordered on legendary. She didn't waste time with sympathy or speeches. She simply spread every document across her conference table, adjusted her glasses, and asked me one question. Do you want justice or do you want peace? I thought about Julia for a long moment before answering. She had spent her entire career teaching children that actions always had consequences, even when the consequences arrived much later than expected. Justice, I finally said. Margaret nodded. Then we let them keep talking. Over the following week, my family gave us more evidence than we could have gathered on our own. Eric emailed me construction updates, thanking me for making his dream possible. My father texted that the bank manager had complimented our family's financial strength. My mother left a voicemail, reminding me to transfer the banquet deposit before Friday because invitations had already been mailed. Every message assumed I had agreed. Every message quietly admitted they had built the entire project around my money without ever asking for my permission. Margaret instructed me to save everything. People think words disappear, she said. They don't. They become exhibits. Then something happened none of us expected. Late one Friday afternoon, the branch manager from the bank called me personally. His voice carried the careful tone professionals use when they know they're about to deliver difficult news. During an internal audit, another document had surfaced that wasn't included in the original loan package. It was a notarized personal guarantee supposedly signed by both me and Julia 6 months before her death. My heart stopped. Julia had never met with that bank. She had never discussed Eric's restaurant. She certainly had never agreed to guarantee his business. I drove to the branch immediately. The manager handed me the document without saying a word. At first glance, the signature looked convincing, but I knew Julia's handwriting better than anyone alive. She always crossed her capital J with a slight curve at the top. This signature was perfectly straight. Someone had copied her name the way a stranger would. I stared at it until the words blurred. For months after losing her, I had convinced myself grief couldn't surprise me anymore. I was wrong. Seeing her name used like a financial tool reopened every wound. I thought it had begun to heal. I left the bank carrying the document as carefully as if it were made of glass. Margaret's expression hardened the moment she saw it. This changes everything, she said quietly. Forging your signature is fraud. Forging the signature of someone who is now deceased makes this much more serious. She contacted the bank's legal department before I even left her office. By Monday morning, the loan had been frozen pending investigation. Construction payments stopped immediately. Suppliers suspended deliveries. Contractors refused to continue work until ownership and financial responsibility could be verified. Eric called me 6 times that day. I didn't answer. My parents left increasingly frantic voicemails asking what was happening with the bank and whether I knew why everyone had suddenly stopped returning their calls. I listened to every message once, saved them into the evidence folder, and waited. On Wednesday evening, my father appeared unannounced at my front door. The confidence he had carried for months was gone. He looked exhausted. He walked into my living room without waiting to be invited and asked, almost in a whisper, "Did you do this?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "I just stopped protecting the people who did." He tried explaining that everything had been done for the family, that Eric only needed one opportunity, that I would eventually have understood. When he finished, I opened my desk drawer, removed Julia's notebook, and placed it between us. On the first page were the words she had written years earlier. "When something feels wrong, write everything down before someone rewrites it for you." I closed the notebook and looked him in the eye. "I've been writing everything down," I said quietly. "Now it's your turn to explain it." He didn't answer. He stood there for several seconds, nodded once without looking at me, and walked out the front door. As his car disappeared down the street, my phone buzzed with a new email from Margaret. The subject line contained only 5 words. "They've requested a settlement." Meeting. I knew then that the real battle hadn't even started. I arrived at Margaret's office 15 minutes early, carrying the same leather folder that had slowly grown thicker over the past month. When I first started adding documents to it, I thought I was collecting evidence. Sitting in the reception area that morning, I realized I had actually been collecting the truth page by page, until it became impossible for anyone to argue with it. Margaret walked into the conference room with a calm smile and told me one sentence that immediately lowered my pulse. "Today, you don't have to prove anything." They do. A few minutes later, my parents arrived with their attorney, while Eric followed several steps behind them. He looked nothing like the confident entrepreneur who had spread blueprints across my dining table only weeks earlier. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by wrinkled clothes and tired eyes. My mother wouldn't look at me, and my father's usual confidence had been replaced by stubborn silence. Their attorney began by suggesting everyone approach the situation with understanding because families sometimes make emotional decisions during periods of grief. Margaret didn't even glance at me before replying. "Forgery isn't an emotion." The room became very quiet. My father finally cleared his throat and admitted they had used my financial information because they believed I would eventually support Eric once the restaurant was close to opening. He insisted no one intended to hurt me, that everything had been done with good intentions. I asked him one question. "If you believed I would say yes, why didn't you ask?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, my father had no answer. Eric leaned forward and admitted the business had been failing before it even opened. Construction costs had doubled. Suppliers demanded advance payments, and investors had started backing out. My parents had convinced him that using my name would only be temporary until the restaurant became profitable. He said he knew it was wrong, but he had allowed himself to believe that family would forgive family. I looked at him and said quietly, "Forgiveness begins with honesty, not entitlement." Margaret then produced another folder I hadn't seen before. During the bank's investigation, additional emails had been recovered between the contractor, the loan officer, and Eric. Buried among dozens of ordinary business messages was one that changed the entire meeting. It had been written by Eric 3 months earlier. "Nathan doesn't need to know yet. Once the place is open, he'll never report us, because he wouldn't destroy his own brother's future." Reading those words hurt far more than discovering the forged signatures. It proved this hadn't been a desperate mistake made under pressure. It had been a calculated decision, built on the belief that my love for my family made me predictable. Eric lowered his head the moment the email was read aloud. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I thought you'd protect us like you always had." I took a long breath before answering. "You stopped asking me for help years ago. You started assigning me responsibility instead." "No." One spoke for several moments. Finally, their attorney asked whether I would consider resolving everything without taking the matter to court. I looked at Margaret, then back at my family. "I'm willing to settle," I said, "but not because we're related, because I don't want to spend the next 3 years of my life reliving the worst." 1. Margaret slid a written proposal across the table. It required every forged document to be withdrawn immediately. Formal written corrections to every bank and supplier. Repayment of every legal and investigative expense I had incurred. And one condition I added myself. Eric would publicly remove my name from every business record. Interview, promotional announcement, and investor presentation connected to the restaurant. My success would never again be used as collateral for someone else's ambition. My father looked at the agreement for a long time before quietly asking whether this would end everything. I answered honestly, it ends the legal part. The rest depends on whether trust can grow. Back after being buried this deep, he slowly signed the papers. My mother followed with trembling hands. Eric hesitated the longest, before finally writing his name at the bottom of the last page. As the meeting ended and everyone stood to leave, I remained seated for another minute, staring at the now signed agreement. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt lighter, not because my family had lost, but because I had finally stopped carrying a weight that had never belonged to me. As I slipped the agreement back into my folder, Margaret smiled and said, "You know, most people think justice is about punishment." I asked what she thought it was. She closed the folder and replied, "Sometimes justice is simply making sure the truth is the only story left." Standing, I carried those words with me as I walked out of the building, unaware that one final surprise was waiting for me. A surprise that would force me to decide whether I was ready to close this chapter forever or open one last door into my family's past. I walked out of Margaret's office believing the hardest part of my life was finally behind me. The settlement had been signed, the forged documents had been withdrawn, and every bank, supplier, and contractor had received formal notice that I had never guaranteed. Eric's restaurant. Legally, the matter was over. Emotionally, I knew it would take much longer. 3 days later, I returned to my office to find a small, cardboard box sitting outside my door, with no return address. Inside were Julia's favorite fountain pen, a framed photograph from our 5th anniversary that I hadn't realized was missing from my house, and a sealed envelope with my father's handwriting on it. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. The letter wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even an apology in the traditional sense. It was the first honest thing my father had ever written to me. He admitted that for years they had relied on me because I always found a way to fix every crisis. At some point, helping had stopped feeling like generosity and started feeling like an obligation they believed they were entitled to. He confessed that when Julia died, they didn't see a grieving husband. They saw financial security they assumed would eventually become the family's solution. Reading those words hurt, but they also answered questions I had been carrying for years. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it in the same cabinet where I kept the evidence from the case. It belonged there because it was part of the truth. A month later, I learned the restaurant project had officially been canceled. The property was sold before construction was completed, and the remaining investors walked away after recovering what little they could. Eric called me that evening. It was the first time he had reached out without asking for anything. He told me he had accepted a management position at a neighborhood cafe, that he was finally learning what it meant to build something one day at a time, instead of chasing shortcuts. He apologized, not for getting caught, but for believing my success existed to rescue him from his own failures. I thanked him for saying it and wished him well. But when the conversation ended, I didn't promise we'd become close again. Some bridges can be rebuilt. Others remain standing only as reminders of where we should never cross again. As the seasons changed, I found myself thinking less about everything I had lost and more about everything Julia had quietly taught me while she was alive. She had always believed that the best way to honor pain was to make sure someone else suffered a little less because of it. With that in mind, I created the Julia Cole Financial Integrity Grant, a program that provided free forensic accounting services to elderly people in small business, owners who suspected they had been victims of fraud but couldn't afford professional help. The first case we accepted involved a retired couple whose life savings had nearly disappeared because they trusted the wrong person. When we recovered their money, I drove home with tears in my eyes for the first time since Julia's funeral, not because I was grieving, but because I finally felt like I was carrying her kindness forward instead of carrying my family's expectations. My parents and I never returned to what we once were. We exchanged polite holiday cards, occasional birthday messages, and little else. Strangely, that distance no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. Every morning before leaving for work, I still pass the small shelf in my living room where Julia's photograph sits beside the notebook she gave me years ago. The first page remains unchanged. When something feels wrong, write everything down before someone rewrites it for you. Those words didn't just protect my finances, they protected my identity. Looking back, I realized my family never stole $80,000 from me. They almost stole something far more valuable. The belief that my worth depended on how much I was willing to sacrifice for people who would never do the same for me. The day I stopped confusing love with obligation was the day I became free. I no longer measure relationships by what I can provide. I measure them by whether trust exists when there's nothing to gain. My signature still carries value, but now it appears only on documents I choose to sign, for people who have earned that privilege. And every time I write my name, I'm reminded that the most important contract I ever honored wasn't with a bank, a business, or even my family. It was the quiet promise I finally made to myself that I would never again let anyone spend my future without my permission.